Louis XV was 15 years old when he married his 22-year-old bride, Maria Leszczyńska. They had 10 pregnancies in a row. Initially, Louis was faithful, and the couple seemed quite happy. But when Louis was around 23, he began to become interested in other women and grew bored of his wife. The Queen was also completely exhausted by being constantly pregnant, and she began restricting access to her bed. After a brutal miscarriage, doctors warned her that another pregnancy could end her life. So she began locking her door and telling the king she was too tired. And so the mistresses began, one after the other. By the time the king reached his 30s, the boredom had turned into a restless hunger. For 12 years, Louis had cycled through 4 sisters from the same family, sometimes overlapping, until finally he reached the youngest and most ambitious, Marie-Anne de Mailly-Nesle, the Duchesse of Châteauroux. Marie-Anne was considered the beauty of the sisters. The court at Versailles described her as magnificently beautiful with a brilliant complexion. She had striking blue eyes and a dignified, almost regal presence that commanded any room she entered. With all of these alluring qualities, the court's most ruthless political operators saw in her the opportunity to command the king. At the time, her eldest sister, Madame de Mailly, was the reigning mistress and had been for the last decade. She was gentle, politically uninterested, and entirely useless to the ambitious men at court. They were furious that the king's cautious ministers were mismanaging the ongoing war, and they knew the only way to force the king to take aggressive personal command of the battlefield was to install a puppet in his bed. When they noticed the king's eyes lingering on Marie-Anne, they stepped in to orchestrate the affair. They knew the king was used to women surrendering easily, so they coached her to play hard to get. Under their guidance, Marie-Anne told the king, when he began making advances, that she would only yield to him if her sister was stripped of her official court position, stripped of her apartments, and physically removed from the grounds of Versailles. Louis was captivated by Marie-Anne and desperate for the energy she provided. He caved. He discarded the woman who had loved him for a decade and granted Marie-Anne the title of Duchess. Marie-Anne's sister left in tears, taking nothing with her but her debts. With her position secured in the royal bedroom, Marie-Anne now had to deliver for the men who put her there. The political operators wanted the king to lead the war effort, and Marie-Anne became the loudest voice in his ear. She shamed him. She reminded him that his great-grandfather, the legendary Sun King, Louis XIV, had led his troops into battle. The French public was already mocking Louis as a do-nothing king, and she continued to be in his ear to do something to prove them wrong. In May of 1744, Louis finally agreed to head to the eastern frontier to lead his army in the War of Austrian Succession. Initially, he left his mistress behind. Louis wanted to project a focused warrior king, but Marie-Anne was terrified of losing her political grip while he was away, so she refused to stay in Versailles. Marie-Anne had recently strong-armed the king into appointing her to the highest female position at court. She had been given the title of the superintendent of the household of the future Dauphine. Marie-Anne used this title as her official excuse to travel with Louis and his army. She claimed she was inspecting things. everyone knew it was a lie. She followed the army to the front lines. This created a highly visible display of adultery that completely destroyed the king's heroic image and scandalized the religiously devout French. The soldiers who were marching to bleed and possibly die for their monarch were infuriated at the spectacle. They began openly mocking the royal carriages and wrote lewd songs referring to Marie-Anne as the king's baggage. In August, the procession arrived in the great city of Metz, and as they entered, the great cathedral of Metz loomed over the royal entourage, standing as a towering monument of divine judgment. Louis set up his military headquarters at the nearby abbey, and it was here that a sudden, violent fever struck the king. On the night of August 8th, after a heavy dinner, he collapsed in the royal apartments. He vacillated between chills so strong it made his teeth chatter and waves of fever that made him sweat to the point that his bed sheets were soaked. He writhed in agony and his skin turned a sickly pale gray. Delirium began to cloud his mind. Louis's physicians were terrified of losing him. They repeatedly bled the king from his arm and his foot. They gave him things to try to make him vomit. The excessive bleeding only drained away whatever physical strength the king had left. And as his body failed and his breathing grew shallow, panic set in. Despite his scandalous lifestyle, Louis was a man of deep faith. He was obsessed with death. He would frequently ask courtiers where they wanted to be buried and harbored a terrifying, deeply ingrained fear of hell. The moment his body failed, his mind instantly jumped to divine retribution. As the fever spiked, his physical collapse triggered a massive psychological one. He became convinced that this illness was no accident. It was a direct punishment from God for flaunting his adultery in a war zone. As Louis was convinced his death was imminent, he desperately called for his priest. The king's first almoner, the Bishop of Soissons, entered the bedchamber. As the first almoner, he had absolute authority of the king's religious life, his confessions, and his access to the sacraments. But he was also loyal to the king's rival political faction. This faction was deeply against Marie-Anne and the men who had placed her in the king's bed. The bishop saw the monarch's vulnerability as the perfect opportunity to execute a ruthless political coup. He weaponized the church's theology against the dying man and declared that by bringing a mistress to the army, the king had created a public scandal that required a public reckoning. In this moment, the bishop held the literal keys to heaven. He laid down his absolute terms. He refused to hear the king's confession or administer the last rites, explicitly stating, "The laws of the church forbid me to administer the sacrament to you as long as the Duchesse of Châteauroux is here." Louis was forced with a choice: his mistress or eternal damnation. The king broke. Weeping and physically helpless, Louis turned to his attendants and surrendered. "We must submit. Tell her to leave." Marie-Anne was finished, and to avoid being torn apart by the soldiers and citizens of Metz, Marie-Anne was forced to sneak out of the city at dawn in a borrowed, unmarked carriage that offered absolutely no protection. Along the road back to Paris, angry mobs recognized her. They pelted the carriage with stones and screamed slurs and profanities at her. But banishing the mistress was not enough. The church demanded the king's pride be permanently broken to reassert their supremacy over the crown. The bishop ensured that the king's total capitulation was not just a private victory for the clergy, but also a highly public humiliation. He drafted a formal confession and commanded that it be proclaimed immediately. The formal confession was then taken to the towering cathedral and read out loud for all to hear. From the pulpit, before the gathered clergy and the citizens of the city, the king's total surrender was read out loud exactly as it had been drafted. The bishop made sure the text struck at the very core of the French monarchy's divine right. He forced the king to explicitly apologize for the public scandal and renounce his own religious legitimacy. The king asked pardon of God for his offense and of his people for the scandal he has given them. He declares that he is unworthy to bear the title of Most Christian King. And the declaration didn't stop there. To ensure the rival political party was permanently defeated, the church forced the king to publicly swear that his future would be dictated by religious devotion and not political ambition. If God restores him to health, he is resolved to devote himself entirely to the repentance of his sins, the defense of religion, and the relief of his people. The king would indeed survive. Just days after the confession was read, in fact, Marie-Anne would take back her place next to the king's side and exact a swift and thorough revenge, dying just weeks later. And the Bishop of Soissons would be banished from court.